faculty lecture series here at Houghton College. And this afternoon, to close this year's series, we get to hear from my colleague in communication and business, Professor Daniel Minchen. I've been looking forward to this talk since Dan proposed it a year ago. As he said to me at the time, here's this great topic in regional religious history. It's got a communication angle, and no one's written about it. I love it that in addition to talks that give us a window into big trends in our disciplines, we also have talks that are plowing new ground. Dan came to Houghton in 2006 for a second, or maybe it was a third act in a long, distinguished, and varied career. He started out in broadcasting, first with the U.S. Army, where he won a medal for, is this dating you too much? For television coverage of the moon landings and the other Apollo moon missions. After his honorable discharge, he returned to upstate New York, serving as a reporter in Buffalo, a news director in Albany, and a broadcaster in Rochester. If Dan's career has had three acts, I think that's Act One, rising to become a prominent face and voice on the air in one of the two top markets upstate. That would be a career in itself for many people. But then Act Two, a career in public relations at Xerox, where Dan started as a spokesperson but was placed in positions of greater and greater responsibility until he retired as director of PR for Xerox for all their developing market operations, using skills he'd begun honing as he worked on bilingual campaigns for the Canadian division. That sounds like a career too. But now Act Three, college professor. And he's distinguished himself here as well. I asked Dan's colleagues about him, and they told me that he's a news junkie, perpetually bringing things straight from the front page or the morning news hour into the afternoon's class. That's indicative of something deeper, I think, something on display in his work on this afternoon's talk. One of Dan's colleagues wrote to me, "He is genuinely and insatiably curious. I've rarely encountered a faculty colleague more interested in hearing the ideas and opinions of other people. He asks and asks and asks, never as a pretext for setting up an opportunity to spout his own views." As I said, Dan wrote to me, it was almost exactly a year ago, to propose this talk, and I remember the email well. There was this church in early 20th century Buffalo, the first megachurch there, one of the first anywhere. It got started in a Billy Sunday crusade. It's where one of the major Buffalo stations got its start, and no one's written anything about it. I'm doing a voice, but Dan's voice, the intensity of his interest, leapt off the screen. Dan's still a reporter, see? Maybe Act 4 is going to be as a documentary film producer, and we, this afternoon, will be able to say we were there at the beginning. And Minchen, who will be sharing his research on the rise and fall of Buffalo's first megachurch.
Oh, my. Wow. I am humbled by that introduction. My goodness, is that really me?
It's you.
Thank you so much, Ben. And as I was saying to Ben a little bit ago, these lecture series are not really in his job description. This is something he does for the love of the Academy, for the opportunities to allow people like me to dig into things that are of personal interest, to try and bring those forth. So there's such a great interest in sharing knowledge and just digging deeper into topics, and you spearhead it with this lecture and many others that have been given. So thank you so much for that introduction, and to the rest of you, thank you so much for coming today. As you will hear, my remarks are a culmination of ongoing research into a once dominant church in Buffalo, one that was responsible for the conversion of thousands, countless souls, one that lost its dominance. Eventually, and over a period of 35 years, it ceased to be. It was a bright light shining in downtown Buffalo, one that self-extinguished. Its radio voice morphed into the polar opposite of what it once stood for. Its pastor was a luminary, a sophisticate, some would say a showman. Most would agree that he was an outstanding businessman, shrewd, visionary, and calculated. A man to whom leadership and influence came naturally. But what is this institution that I'm referring to? And who was the leader? It's the Churchill Evangelistic Tabernacle, governed and I use that word decidedly, by the Reverend Dr. Clinton H. Churchill. Dr. Churchill's story runs the gamut from sock salesman to imbiber, to inspired preacher without credentials, to dedicated evangelist, to a fiery accuser who sounded something like Father Coughlin, from a rebellious whiskey drinker to a thundering teetotaler, a poor man who claimed to earn less than $800 a year in his Christian work, to a retired Florida living broadcaster who left an estate estimated at $10 million, which in today's money is $55 million. From a man who claimed that radio was his hobby to a broadcast magnate. He made a huge mark on Buffalo's broadcast industry. In fact, in his published obituaries, they called him a radio pioneer, but they go very lightly on his 35-year career as a noted evangelist. And they say nothing about the souls that he was responsible for saving. So who was Clinton H. Churchill anyway? How shall we remember him? Let's take a look. If the term megachurch had been coined in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the Churchill Tabernacle would have owned it. Today, according to the editorial writers at the Wall Street Journal, the term megachurch comprises a regular religious gathering of about 1,500 people per service, perhaps 2,000. Those numbers match what the Tabernacle regularly achieved, even during the Great Depression. But megachurch implies more than attendance. Leaders of megachurches have outsized influence and visibility in their communities. Take Rick Warren of Saddleback, or Bill Hybels of Willow Creek, or Tim Keller of Redeemer in New York, or Joel Osteen of Lakewood in Houston. They're well known, they're covered in the media, but they have wide influence. If you wind the tape back 80 years, Clinton Churchill fit that megachurch model. His tabernacle originally held space for 3,200 people, very large for 1925, and he sent out sermons not by satellite, but by the city's most powerful radio station. And listenership, including over the air, was every bit as big as Saddleback or Willow Creek. The first book Churchill wrote was called Gospel on the Air, published in 1927. In the foreword, Churchill says his total attendance the year before, 1926, was 235,000 people. That equates to more than 4,000 counting per service, counting all the morning and evening services. But then he added in that foreword, but my radio congregation greatly outnumbers the visible audience. Churchill also fit the role as the optic role as mega minister. As one former attendee told me, he dressed elegantly, dapper down to his shoes. He entered his packed services only after the rousing warm-up of his song leader, choir, and adoring congregation. He would walk down the tabernacle aisle. All eyes seemed to be on him as he approached the platform. Then he would walk up and he would place a very prominently viewed Bible on the stand, and with a voice that was described to me as sonorous, he'd begin by saying, "Now open your Bibles." His voice, I am told, filled the rectangular auditorium, though oddly, there are no known transcriptions of his radio programs or any of his sermons. So I have actually not heard him, nor have many other Buffalo historians heard him either. We're still hoping to find that elusive recording, provided it exists. Clinton Churchill founded and ran Buffalo's most powerful radio station, WKBW, well-known Bible Witness, which became a 50,000-watt powerhouse that blanketed the eastern part of the United States and Canada. KB, as it became known, regularly carried Churchill sermons. In fact, they were broadcast several times a day on Sunday and at other times as well. The Lord's Day would end with an hour-long broadcast called the Back Home Hour, starting at 11 p.m. The schedule varied over the years, but it's fair to say that a Buffalonian with a radio could start Sunday and end it with Bible teaching and words of salvation from Clinton H. Churchill. In the late 1940s, Dean Liddick tells me that WKBW carried a 15-minute program called Voices in the Morning. It originated here at Houghton on WJSL, the college's radio station. The late Al Smith, the one-time manager of Houghton's printing services, used to climb up a pole to hook up telephone wires that carried our signal to WKBW's studios up in Hamburg. For 2 years at 7:15 in the morning, Houghton's singing and short gospel messages were a regular part of WKBW's broadcast day. In its heyday, this is what the Tabernacle looked like. No spires, no bell tower, no carillon. It was a flat-fronted rectangular building with no graceful lawn and no parking lot, no Gothic stone, no stained glass. Architecturally, I would call it unremarkable. However, it featured one attribute that simply could not be missed: a giant cross of Calvary, emblazoned with the words, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," and a circular clock which itself carried a message, "Take time for God." In marketing terms, its positioning line was Buffalo's largest spiritual workshop, the place where people worked out their relationship with God. An estimated 20,000 vehicles per day crossed in front of the Tabernacle at Main and Utica. It was a spiritual marker, a milestone, and a landmark. Besides not looking like a church, Churchill broke other conventions as well. He emblazoned the doors of this old truck with his pulpit message, "Salvation in Jesus Christ," and apparently he paraded this up and down the streets of Buffalo. It's unknown whether he used it as a traveling pulpit, but we do know that Churchill held street meetings in downtown Buffalo, so it wouldn't be very far-fetched to think that he or his associates preached off the back of a pickup truck in Buffalo. The Tabernacle in its day drew big names and big crowds. National figures spoke here. One was Billy Sunday, who returned to Buffalo numerous times as Churchill's guest. Another was Rodney Smith, known as Gypsy Smith, the famed British evangelist who was born into the Roma population and who worked with the Salvation Army. Homer Rodehaver, Billy Sunday's song leader for 20 years, was another frequent guest, he and his trombone. In fact, B.D. Ackley, a composer and an editor in Rodehaver's publishing company, joined Churchill as his minister of music. Helen Sunday, known as Ma Sunday, Billy's wife, visited and spoke there. Then there was Oswald Smith, the well-known Canadian evangelist from the People's Church in Toronto. And there were others from Cleveland and Syracuse and still other places. At least one Houghton faculty member, and maybe there were more, was a special guest at the New Year's Eve service at the Tabernacle. He was Wesleyan scholar Dr. Claude Reese, for whom the third-floor conference room is named. Here's a newspaper display ad published by the Tabernacle promoting Dr. Reese's message during the Watch Night service, which was popular in those days on New Year's Eve. I found an interesting picture of Dr. Reese when I was doing this. He's playing Chinese checkers here with some students, so apparently there was a little more than Bible teaching going on at the institution. He looks like he's having a lot of fun, and he may even be winning, who knows. Churchill, as such, is what then I would call a regional evangelist. His reputation seemed to stop short of being national. Toma Hangen, in her book Redeeming the Dial, cites Paul Rader, Amy Semple McPherson, and Charles Fuller as the period's evangelists with national reputations. Kevin Key, in a book called Revivalist, says Oswald Smith filled that role in Canada. But Churchill's name doesn't appear to make the list. Dr. Grant Walker, the distinguished professor of Christian history at Duke Divinity School, who spoke here at Houghton last year, was unfamiliar with the name Clinton Churchill. The book Primetime Religion, calling itself the Encyclopedia of Religious Broadcasting, doesn't list him. The Billy Graham Library in Charlotte, North Carolina, has no reference to Clinton Churchill. Neither does the library at Fuller Theological Seminary in the Los Angeles area. Nevertheless, in Western New York State, Christian circles in the 1920s through the 1950s, Churchill's name was known. In his autobiography, 20 Years with Billy Sunday, Homer Rodehaber mentioned only one of Billy Sunday's converts by name, and that was Clinton Churchill. He called him an outstanding example of a person who established a permanent work of evangelism, citing the Churchill Evangelistic Tabernacle with records at that time of more than 50,000 conversions to Christ. So here's where I take issue with myself about Churchill being regional. As mentioned, Churchill produced and preached on the Back Home Hour every Sunday night. The one-hour program was carried on the CBS radio network with some 30 stations across the United States. So, in a sense, he was a national figure. There's all the stations down there. His radio program developed a considerable following. It featured top-flight Christian music, much of it classical. Small orchestras were heard, as well as soloists and vocal groups. B.D. Ackley led what was known as the white-robed choir of Tabernacle fame. Here are some of the clippings that referred to the kind of music he played. Interestingly, as you'll see over here, his theme was Ave Maria, which was a little unusual for an evangelistic Christian. Listeners responded to Churchill's program. They wrote letters from all over the place. One said, "We've just listened to your program, and it's brought such inspiration and comfort. We love the lovely hymns. We have no people at all. We lost all we had when they bombed the Philippines. But you don't know what a wonderful feeling you have given us." That was addressed to Dr. Churchill. Another one said from Burnt River, Ontario, he described Churchill's preaching as manna to a hungry soul. These radio listeners constituted what Churchill called his larger congregation beyond the tabernacle walls. He said they numbered as many as 80 million. And so, did this make him national? Or even transnational? Or was he a local preacher with a big following? Sunday in and Sunday out, the tabernacle crackled with activity, from special music led by George Going of local fame to the men's quartet. It even had a colored men's group, to the children's activities and street meetings, and the so-called young people's events. The young people called it the Tab, and it was the place to go. Well, a lot's changed. Today, that hallowed structure is empty, dark, damp. I've been in it. It's full of the junk of successive occupations. Its sign is long, long gone. Nobody knows what happened to it. Its external gospel messages all painted over or removed. Its front door is padlocked, and a large banner is hung across the front door. What's more, as I mentioned, Churchill is remembered best in Buffalo history as the father of WKBW television, not as the man who fed manna to those hungry souls. And the radio station he pioneered became one of the top rock and roll outlets in the United States, leading the way for the immense popularity of rock music and the culture change that it brought with it. It was the kind of music the preachers of the day condemned as the devil's music, the powerful signal that once stood for well-known Bible witness now carried the Billboard Top 40 with all the general rebellion that brought along with it. What happened? I think you'll agree with me. That is a major sea change. Well, I'll try and suggest some answers, but Mr. Churchill did not make it very easy. Buffalo broadcast historian Marty Binias told me Churchill seemed to retreat from public view in his later years. He left behind very little. 2 books in his early career, 10 years of printed sermons, again from his early ministry. But his legacy is of a wealthy broadcaster who owned 2 radio stations, one in Buffalo, the other in San Francisco, and the Buffalo TV station, Channel 7, which I presume most of you watch today. These are interesting, but I've not been able to find personal materials. letters, recordings, or lectures that would give me insight into his thinking, especially in the later years. Nevertheless, a man like this drew a lot of press, and so I've relied mainly on secondary research consisting of reading many newspaper articles. There are 500 of them contained in the New York State newspaper archives. I've also been able to interview a few people from that era who are still alive. So the primary research I did is conducted with a small set of very elderly people, but lucid folks. From these and a few artifacts and from personal recollections of my family members, some of whom attended the Tabernacle, I've put this together. And I want to thank many, many people who helped me along the way in this last year. I list their names at the end, and I'd like to just point them out to you. Well, a little bit about Churchill himself. He was born in Buffalo in 1888, the son of DeForest and Jenny Churchill. The elder Mr. Churchill was an insurance executive, and his wife stayed home to raise Clinton. DeForest Churchill succeeded, very much so. He was quite a prominent insurance man. Young Clinton attended Buffalo schools. He did not distinguish himself. But from sermons given in his later life, we know that at an early age, perhaps around 13, he longed to go into business. He seemed to have this dynamic drive to make money. His parents wanted him to go to college and become a lawyer, but Clinton would have none of it. To this, his father told him that he would be an ignoramus for missing college. But young Clinton showed a stubborn streak, or a strong-minded streak. He stayed his course. His mother was a turn-of-the-century mom, caring greatly but silently for her child, and she prayed a lot for him. So she seemed to be the deeply spiritual one in the family. In his teens and 20s, Churchill lived an indulgent life, and she showed an enormous restraint by not moralizing with him. Instead, she said her weapon was prayer. DeForest Churchill's prediction that his son would be an ignoramus was clearly inaccurate. The younger Churchill showed ambition and drive. At first, he entered the Buffalo retail business, working at J.N. Adam, a big department store that once served downtown Buffalo. There he rose from a clerk to a merchandise manager, and at some point, here's the point that's unclear, I'm told that he went to Cleveland, where he became a drunkard. I don't have any proof of that, but that's what was told to me. And it does show up in some form in one of his sermons. And let me say this about his sermons. About 150 of them, plus or minus, exist in written form. He was an extemporaneous preacher, so stenographers took down his words as they were delivered. He apparently used no recording mechanisms of any kind, even although they were available. And the use of stenographers stopped in 1933, presumably because of the Great Depression. So there is a void as to what was exactly said during those periods of time. However, in what I will call his confessional sermon, which he preached twice and which was taken down, he referenced his time as a lost and a rebellious sinner. He also said he liked women. Take from that what you will. But in what I can see was rather typical Churchill bluntness. His confession spoke generally of his wayward life, but it lacked details. His description of that time ended with this: "Don't expect me to get into details. It would only serve for you to criticize me. Besides, it is none of your business." He said he'd confessed his acts, whatever they were, to the Lord. He was forgiven. He forgave himself, and now he was trying to mute his memories. Well, sometimes we think of confessions ending in sobs, but this one didn't. In my mind's eye, I see the door slamming shut, rattling the door frame. Such verbal strength in demolishing any potential reaction marked a part of Clinton Churchill that would show itself again, a part that might make his likability a little less likable. The confession sermon, by the way, was uncharacteristic of Churchill. In the other sermons I've examined, he made scant reference to his family or his personal life. He said he preferred to keep private matters private. So with his past failings rhetorically behind him, Churchill proceeded to tell of his desire to be a businessman, of his cavorting with business luminaries while he was living a high life. He'd been raised in the Methodist Church, he said, but when he was 16, he left the church because he saw hypocrisy. He said he met some of the pillars in drinking emporiums in downtown Buffalo, and that turned him off. He said he would never darken a church door again. But one day, that stance weakened. You could lay the blame, so to speak, on a man named Billy Sunday. It would help to understand a little about who he was. William Ashley Sunday was born here in 1864 on an Iowa farm 28 years before Clinton Churchill. Sunday's father died as part of a Civil War campaign, leaving his mother and brother to try and survive as farmers, but it didn't work. Before long, Mrs. Sunday sent the boys to an orphanage where the headmaster and his wife were Christians, and it was here that Billy was exposed to the deeper aspects of faith and where his athletic abilities were discovered. By the way, Dr. Douglas Gardy has written a superior and detailed thesis on the life of Billy Sunday, and I would highly recommend that you read it. Because of those athletic skills, Billy soon joined the Chicago White Stockings baseball club, and I'm leaving out an awful lot of information here. But Billy was a superb runner and a base stealer, and as a right fielder, he was able to run at lightning speed and catch fly balls. Mind you, he did not have a baseball glove. Those were the days before baseball gloves. After a game, many players would resort to the saloon district in Chicago, and they got drunk, sometimes dead drunk, and the ruination of their health or their families oftentimes followed. One day, however, Billy made a different choice. He shunned the bar and he turned to a place called the Pacific Garden Mission, where he accepted the grace and forgiveness of Christ. At great cost, he ended his lucrative baseball career, and eventually he became a traveling evangelist. This is the way it looks right now in Chicago. That's not the original Pacific Garden Mission, but if you go in there, you can go to the Billy Sunday Chapel, and there's a pulpit that Billy himself pounded. It's still in one piece. I'm not sure how. Now, Billy had a very fast tongue, a split-second mind, and a growling visage. His rubbery legs carried him back and forth on a stage like an athlete. To make points, he'd pound pulpits, at times, I'm told, breaking them. He would even throw chairs to emphasize something. Dr. Gardy pointed that out in one of his reports about Billy Sunday in New York in 1917. Billy stressed the evils of drinking and the necessity of salvation in Christ, or eternal damnation in a very hot, flame-licking hell. Some people accused him of being a vaudeville act, and he wasn't. But he was entertaining, and for many others, he was convincing.
Civilization and society rests on morals. Morals rest on religion. Religion rests on the Bible and faith in God and in Jesus Christ. The Bible doesn't condemn any man because of his wealth. The Bible says the man that don't provide for his family is worse than an infidel. No. According to our standard of gold and silver, Abraham was worth $1.5 billion. David was worth $3 billion. Solomon was worth $5 billion. Solomon could have hired Andrew Carnegie for a butler, J. Pierpont Morgan to cut his lawn, and Andrew Mellon for a chauffeur, and John D. to black his boots. America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose turned on her. And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go sweeping through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
His publicity, his way of preaching, brought huge crowds, and that meant that Sunday had to build big temporary structures in which to hold his meetings, sometimes for several months. Such was the case in Buffalo. It was 1917, February, winter. This was tough weather, and Billy rolled into town. His wooden, specially built tabernacle took the shape of a turtleback, And by the way, it was on land that eventually was used to build Offerman Stadium, the original home of the Buffalo Bisons. Churchill naturally heard of Billy's Buffalo appearance, as did his business friends, and the group wanted to see this spectacle. So during Billy's preaching, Churchill became deeply convinced of his need to make Christ the Lord of his life. But as Billy called for the convicted to come forward to hit the sawdust trail, to shake his hand, indicating their acceptance of Jesus as Lord, Churchill couldn't do it. He attended numerous Buffalo meetings with the same result. He froze as the invitation to Christ was given. Well, one night in February, after resisting the call, Churchill went to his home where his mother had a gathering, his praying mother. He dismissed himself. He went upstairs to a bedroom alone. He fell to his knees, pouring out his heart to God, asking Christ for forgiveness, and accepting his lordship. He became a Christian that night, not at the crusade, but in the privacy of his mom's home. Well, the next thing he did was to return to the Billy Sunday Tabernacle meeting. He was so anxious to walk the sawdust trail that he rose too early, and he was told by an usher to retake his seat. Then he rose again, and a slow lady was in front of him, and he had to work his way past her. He was very anxious about this, but he did get to the front. He did shake Billy Sunday's hand, which is the Christian form of I do. Churchill had walked the sawdust trail. It was February 21st, 1917. This day was so important to Clinton Churchill that 25 years later, on the night of February 21st, 1942, he held a huge celebratory dinner at the Hotel Lafayette to mark the anniversary of his conversion. Here's a photo of that event in the Hotel Lafayette Ballroom in Buffalo. And there he is, right there, with his wife, Oswald Smith right there, Ma Sunday there, chairman of the dinner here from Cleveland. That's Clinton Churchill. He thought a great deal of that conversion, and it never left him for 25 years. Suffice to say that this handshake was a turning point in Churchill's life. And in his confessional sermon, he tells us there were no more cigars. He loved to smoke a dozen a day of cigars, mind you. No more whiskey, no more alcoholic beverages, which he said he enjoyed. There was no more merchandising, no more insurance business. Within 2 years, just 2, he was leading a small Methodist Episcopal church on Delaware Avenue in Buffalo. But he must have felt confined by this. He wanted to go out and speak to other groups, to larger public gatherings, and give his dramatic conversion story about Christ's redemptive power, and in the process, he created a name for himself. Well, some local Buffalo business people noticed him, and one was Irvine Kittinger, president of the Kittinger Furniture Company. That's the Kittinger Furniture Company, which had a large plant on Elmwood Avenue. Kittinger, a wealthy and well-wired businessman and already an established church member, wanted, and because of the notoriety of Sunday, he wanted to attend one of these crusades. It was either there or in business circles that Kittinger and Churchill met. Impressed with Churchill, Kittinger chose to support his evangelistic campaigns, and this is a crucial link in the ministry of Clinton Churchill. In about 1920, Churchill asked the Methodist Episcopal Church to appoint him as an area evangelist, and he did. He needed a home base, however, and so he left that church, and with the help of supporters, he built a small tabernacle. This is the building as it exists now at the corner of Lafayette and Grant Street in Buffalo. That is his original tabernacle. You can see the words over here, tabernacle. That's what it looked like from a distance. Attendance quickly grew too large for this little building, so he built on the side of it an auditorium, but that also became too small. A bigger facility was needed, and Churchill turned to supporters such as Kittinger and another man by the name of Hiram Dale, a retail executive from New Jersey who had dealings in Buffalo. So Deo was also a Christian, and between Deo, Kittinger, and Churchill, I understand his father was involved in this as well. Churchill raised cash. In 1924, he revealed plans to build a large two-story tabernacle at 1420 Main Street, just north of the Utica intersection. And a year later, 1925, the Churchill Evangelistic Tabernacle opened its doors. Reverend Churchill had entered Buffalo's religious big time. Now let me offer a few points of detail here. Churchill was never listed with any higher education degree. In his self-written biographical background paper, he says he took special work at the Biblical Seminary in New York. Today that's called the New York Theological Seminary. In the early 1920s, Churchill may have taken correspondence courses. The school tells me there's no record of anything like that from that period of time. But we know he was tutored by a respected seminarian in Buffalo, Dr. Charles Drake Skinner, the former president of what was known then as Cazenovia Seminary. But given his outstanding performance, he was awarded full elder status in the Genesee Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and that gave him the wings that he needed. His lack of a formal degree, however, did not mean that Churchill lacked biblical knowledge. In his tutoring, he must have studied very hard. In sermons I've read in two of his books, he shows a remarkable understanding of biblical truths. His knowledge of Scripture was vast. In one sermon, he used more than 12 right-on-the-mark scriptural texts in the course of his talk, which, by an analysis that I gave of its word count, lasted about 45 minutes. And he showed bright insight. For example, in a study of the life of Paul, Churchill makes a slight detour. He focuses on Barnabas, the faithful and level-headed friend of Paul, of Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. And without Barnabas, Churchill said, Paul would not be the Paul that we know today. Barnabas was often overlooked, and Churchill decided to stop that and take a very close look at him. In John 14, he says the entire chapter, 30 verses, is written about a blind man with no name. It's the longest chapter in the book, and the longest treatment of a blind person in the Bible. In his sermon, Churchill skillfully works to his climax, I was blind, but now I see. And then he asked, why did John use so much text to make that one point? His analysis, because we are all blind, starting with himself. He drives home the point that we all need lengthy persuasion so we can finally say, but now I see. His skillful high English preaching drew thousands to the tabernacle. He preached Sunday mornings, often Sunday afternoons, Sunday evenings, again on Sunday night in the back home hour. That was only 15 minutes. Monday was apparently a day off. Then he'd preach at the Tuesday men's Bible study. There was a Wednesday prayer meeting. There was a lot of other business to attend to as well. In fact, he was a fixture there in his corner office. He would do most of his sermon writing right there. This is how the office looks today. However, it's empty, but the polished walnut is still shiny. In 1928, Churchill wrote a second book, perhaps gleaned from these sermons, but this one was more compositional. I think it took the prize that year for the book with the longest title, Atheism in the School, Apostasy in the Church, Anarchy in the World, and God on His Throne. Good luck to librarians who tried to catalog that one. In it, Churchill strongly condemned what he called modernism, the notion that the Bible is not error-free, that miracles have other explanations, and that the sinfulness and depravity of man really should be softened up. In one sermon, he said, no man can be a modernist or a liberalist in the true sense of the word and believe the word of God and in the deity of Jesus Christ. He branded modernism and liberalism as a dragon, as a subtle serpent, and Sadduceeism of our day. As such, his preaching was a strong counterpoint to modernism, and that bold position gained him more followers and more critics. It seems the lines of demarcation were bright red. In the 1940s, well known for these conservative positions, Churchill was invited to Bob Jones University, then in Tennessee, and granted an honorary doctorate. He became the Reverend Dr. Clinton H. Churchill at that point, and he used that title the rest of his life, except for the Reverend part. All of this continued to be widely noticed. Newspapers kept an eye on him. Some of the Sunday sermons that he preached also made the papers. Churchill was, in addition to being strong-willed, petulant and contentious. If he felt he'd been wronged, he'd come out with guns blazing. And when he was offended, someone would hear about it, usually from his pulpit. And this included associates. This also, in addition to the other things, was reported in the newspapers. A major target was Irvine Kittinger, an early supporter of his ministry, later treasurer of the Churchill Evangelistic Association. He couldn't have gotten off the ground without a sugar daddy like Irvine Kittinger. But Kittinger walked into Churchill's crosshairs about 10 years into their relationship. Apparently, he had verbally promised Churchill a considerable sum of money, but he backed away seemingly because he became disenchanted with some of the things that Churchill was preaching, especially criticisms from the pulpit. Well, Churchill was outraged at this. He took Kittinger to court, alleging breach of contract. Churchill got also into a heated battle with George Rand, for whom the Rand Building is named in Buffalo. Rand was the head of Marine Trust, which was pressuring some of Churchill's backers to pay up their loans. Churchill saw this as chiseling the church, and he emblazoned his tabernacle with this large banner draped across the front, decrying Rand for chiseling. The Buffalo Times, a newspaper of the day, ran 5 consecutive stories on the chiseling accusations and splashed them across their 8 columns that they published. In one instance, another preacher from a nearby Main Street church, Dr. George Cook, likened Churchill to Judas, not by name, but by inference. Well, at this, Churchill burst, and he did so from the pulpit, a very public pulpit. Don't forget, his pulpit had a radio station connected to it. His invectives were carried in the newspapers as well as on the air. Dr. Cook, rightly or wrongly, put his finger on a tender nerve, and it seems that money was always the issue. Churchill pleaded with his attendees to offer up more cash because operating expenses were high. One attender referenced a plea for money to maintain the building, and he said to me, and I quote, "How many times do you need to pay for a new roof?" During those days, Churchill wrote a detailed brochure about the Tabernacle ministry. It was very nice. You can get it in the Buffalo Library. It's called Keep This Light Shining. But it's hard to miss the imperative nature of that title. How do you keep the light shining? By giving more and more and more. Churchill even got into a mild contest with none other than William S. Paley, the founder and head of the Columbia Broadcasting System. Churchill sued CBS for breach of contract. You're noticing suing is coming up a lot. There have been a lot of suits in Churchill's life. He sued CBS for breach of contract involving his radio program, but the state Supreme Court decided for Mr. Paley. So it was Paley who was in charge of CBS and not Clinton Churchill. In the midst of the various rants from the pulpit, however, and all the publicity and all the court cases, Churchill did not seem to lose too much support from his congregation. During the years of the Great Depression, mind you, and Buffalo was hit hard by that, attendance kept up. The ministry thrived. In 1938, the Tabernacle sent the Churchill family, now consisting of the Reverend and his wife Edith and their 2 children, to the Middle East on what was called a study tour. And what a tour it was. That's to keep this light shining, sorry. Taking a train to New York and an ocean liner the rest of the way, the Churchills traveled throughout Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Italy, southern France, Gibraltar, and the Azores. They did that by ocean liner. It took 2 months, and they arrived back home for a climactic Easter Sunday service. No costs for that 2-month junket. were ever released. Well, as all the lawsuits and money campaigns and pulpit arguments and other events went on, Churchill did deliver outstanding sermons. He called for conversions, and he maintained the gospel light on Main Street. God's kingdom was being refreshed and populated. It seemed he was fulfilled in his role as an evangelist. But behind the curtain, something else was going on. Churchill was married 3 times. He and his first wife, Sarah Dennison, exchanged vows in 1907, but she died in 1928, a couple of years into his tabernacle. Of what we don't know. There were no children. He married again to a woman who was the first Mrs. Churchill's nurse. She was Edith Esther Gould. This Mrs. Churchill wasn't quite as warm and friendly as the first Mrs. Churchill, but she was a savvy businesswoman. She seemed more like Churchill himself, cooler, refined, dignified. They had 2 children. One was named Edith, like the mother, and the son was named Clinton, like the father. They had different middle names. Churchill and his daughter, as it turned out, had connections to Houghton College. In 1932, when young Edith was just 2 years old, Churchill delivered the baccalaureate address here. The Noonday newspaper noted that Houghton's graduating class that year was 32 people. That's significant. Because of the demands back at the Tabernacle, this is big attendance time back there, he made the 65-mile drive down to Houghton to a very small gathering. It sheds light on the importance of Houghton to Clinton Churchill. When she grew up, the daughter Edith joined the Houghton student body in 1949, and she graduated in 1953. The yearbook lists her involvement in sports and choir. A contemporary recalled that Edith drove a very nice Chevrolet coupe, a black one, as he remembered, a rarity for those times in the early 1950s. As the children were teenagers, the Reverend and Mrs. Churchill went forward with their tabernacle duties. Edith was a pillar in the church. The tabernacle's custom-made hymn books show that she is a principal contributor with other very important individuals. She was a musician herself, a soprano. She sang on the radio. All the press releases they put out mentioned her. In the 1940s, Churchill was the president of the National Religious Broadcasters Association. He also was chair of United World Mission, and on a visit to England, he carried the greetings of none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In '48, he held a very large missions conference in Buffalo and drew people from coast to coast. So he was going strong in 1948. However, for reasons best known to him and his wife, but because of privacy not known to anybody else, it would seem, the family bond was fraying, and it finally broke around the time young Edith entered Houghton here. And when the breakage occurred, my goodness, the marbles spilled all over the place. It came in the form of a lawsuit, sections of which were carried in the press, and it was devastating. It was this development, I believe, that put the padlock on the tabernacle door. Let me get into this a little bit. In about 1950, Mrs. Edith Churchill, through attorneys, filed a suit for divorce, apparently after she and Clinton Churchill had lived apart. She lambasted her husband with headline-grabbing charges, including gross negligence and cruelty. She maintained that she had performed all the obligations and duties of a loyal and faithful wife, but, and I'm quoting from the lawsuit, repeatedly I urged my husband to return to me and reunite our happy family, but he willfully refused to do so. I loved the church and the privilege of working there together with my husband. I have no desire to harm my husband, my church, or my children in any way. Nevertheless, I must be realistic and I must face the cruel facts. She claimed it was him who wanted the divorce, but he had no grounds under New York state law to file one, so she actually had to move to Ohio and establish residence there and file for the divorce in Ohio, which she did. To all her charges, Clinton Churchill made no public statement. One wonders at the rather fantastic charge of cruelty. What in the world did this mean? As a Christian and a leader of Buffalo's megachurch, a divorce for cruelty and gross negligence was simply unthinkable. But it was granted after 22 years, and Edith Churchill slipped out of Buffalo into oblivion back in Ohio, never heard from again. Well, within 1 month, there was a new Mrs. Churchill, Frances Mack Churchill, a marriage that lasted another 22 years. She was described as having a strong personality of her own, great intelligence, and a keen insight into people, business matters, and current affairs. Her attorney is quoted as saying she never slowed down in any aspect of her life. She was also, I'm told, very attractive. And when they got married, she was about 1/2 Churchill's age. He was 62. She was in her early 30s. Indeed, Edith may have seen this as cruelty. She was also, I am told, the Reverend's secretary, so there was a very close working relationship between the two. So while Edith Churchill, the student, was here at Houghton, this was going on. One wonders at its effect. Churchill's son, Clint Jr., seemed ready to step into his father's shoes at the Tabernacle. In an article from the Tabernacle newsletter, he was instructing younger folks here on the merits of street evangelism, but it seemed like a very short career. Some years later, he showed up as a manager at WKBW Radio in Buffalo that his father owned. In fact, he is the person who hired Dan Neverett. Maybe some of you know him, perhaps the very best pop disc jockey Buffalo ever had. Neverett told me that Churchill exhibited no religious fervor. Meanwhile, Churchill, known to his radio staff as Doc, started WKBW television in 1958. His studios are in the Clinton Churchill Tabernacle building, but they changed. So the one-time evangelistic center became an entertainment center. And as Neverett remembered, the seats that were once used, as he put it, as church chairs became studio audience chairs for local programs such as Dialing for Dollars. A few years after the launch of the television station in 1961, Churchill sold all of his Buffalo broadcast properties. He became a very wealthy man. These properties alone netted him $14 million in 1961. He moved to Miami, Florida, passed away in 1973 at the age of 85. Young Clint, as he was known, died in his 50s of what we don't know, but it seems premature. Young Edith, the student who went here, died at 35 of what we don't know. Frances Churchill, the Reverend's heir, became a philanthropist, and she supported the arts, music, and education, specifically Canisius College. Churchill had no known connections with the Jesuit institution, but he gave a very large contribution to the school, and its academic tower is named after him. That's the Churchill Academic Tower. The archivist that I spoke with at Canisius knew very little about Clinton Churchill. In fact, they didn't even have his published obituary. I had to supply it for them. But I don't find this strange. The Canisius connection was more with Churchill's third wife. And she died in 1999 in a fiery car crash right up the road here in Pike. It seems that her lawyer said she was always going very fast. Well, the report of the collision was that she was going too fast. She did not stop for a stop sign, and her Cadillac crashed into a tractor trailer, both of which burst into flame. The driver was not killed, and she was. With the exception of the Churchill Memorial United Methodist Church in Boston, which Churchill paid for in memory of his father, only one other religious organization benefited from the Churchill money, and that was the Salvation Army. John Maynard Keynes, when he was formulating his economic theories, looked back into the 1880s at that time, and this is what he said. He said he thought that those economic forces had become exhausted and run their course. It seems to me that this applies to the tabernacle as well, or at least to its minister. Attendance, as I told you, kept up in the 1940s, but with word of the nasty divorce, the end was in sight. In addition, Clinton Churchill was more than 35 years into the ministry, and maybe he wanted to retire. The tabernacle was downtown, and as Dr. Cameron Earhart told us a few months ago in these very lectures, Buffalo was emptying. The Humboldt Expressway was planned, city residents were traveling to the suburbs, downtown was hollowing out. So as the tabernacle closed, Churchill took on a different role. Danny Neverett told me that Doc was a powerful boss, and when he switched from being a preacher to the general manager of WKBW, Neverett was pulled in front of Doc one time for some kind of employee dispute that they had, and he described Churchill as being very firm, not saying much, and making a verdict, he called it, a pronouncement in just a few words. He was an early form of Judge Judy, I think. But living with his new and much younger wife, Frances Churchill, his shark teeth seemed to fall out. Mrs. Churchill used to like to tell the story of how the two of them were sitting on an airplane returning from New York City, and Frances was eavesdropping on the people sitting behind her, two businessmen. She was listening to what they were saying. Churchill, sort of oblivious to this, not aware, he started to say something to his wife. I can't imagine anybody saying this to Clinton Churchill, but she did. She said, and this is quoted, "Be quiet, Clinton. I'm listening more by listening to them than I am learning from you." Whoa, okay. I guess he buttoned his list. She also liked to tell the story of her husband's hiring success. In about 1960, he hired Tom Joles as weatherman and Rick Azar as a sportscaster and Irv Weinstein for Eyewitness News as Channel 7 went on the air. Churchill said, "Frances, with these guys, we hit the jackpot," and that they did. It's clear at this point, in the late 50s, that the evangelistic fervor was gone. He was now a broadcaster, and the tabernacle was closed. But the Churchill ministry affected an awful lot of people. And as I close up, let me mention just a couple of those. The tabernacle closing, there was a void left in the area. It didn't last long. The Metropolitan Chapel opened on North French Road in Amherst. Some of you might remember that place. Jim Andrews was the popular preacher on WGR Channel 2. He seemed to fill the role that the tabernacle played in its day. Wes Aram, another former tabernacle person, established Circle C Ranch in nearby Delavan. And when Jim Andrews died and the chapel's French Road ministry faded, the chapel at Cross Point was born. And another Wes Aram, this time Wes Jr., is involved in that one. And it is the megachurch of today, weekly attendance of up to 4,000 and 3 campuses, the one up in Lockport and others elsewhere. So the tabernacle did put a lot of seeds out, and many of them sprouted. And in my conclusion, I must say that I am a product of the tabernacle ministry. I never met Reverend Churchill, but I owe a lot to him. My father, who was a single man, lived near the tabernacle. One day he wandered into the tabernacle and he was converted under Clinton Churchill's ministry. But my father had a handicap. My father couldn't talk well. He stuttered. Very serious case of stuttering. And so when he was converted, he was asked by Churchill to go on the radio and give his testimony. The fear that went through him was palpable. But he said, okay. He went before the microphone. He opened his mouth. He spoke very clearly. No stuttering, of any kind. And he was a song leader, preacher. From that time on out, he was healed of that severe case of stuttering. It was at the Tabernacle that my dad met my mother, and they were married by the Reverend Churchill. He nurtured them. He taught them. And the teaching was very good. There they are at the celebration in 1942. They brought that teaching down to me and to my sisters. So regardless of what he eventually became, of what the press wrote about him, about the demise of his ministry, God used Clinton Churchill in my life, and I'm sure countless other people as well. His ministry rose, and sadly, it fell. Churchill had clay feet, don't we all? But we should be comforted that it is not the same with our Lord, because, as the slide says here, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. There's no clay feet with God as there is with us. I thank you very much for your kind attention of this rather personal story. I hope it added to you, and if it did, it would be God's blessing to you. These are some of the people who helped me pull this together. Thank you very much. Do what I can to answer.